Chapter 1, The Arrival. I shall never forget the first time I laid these now tired old eyes on our visitor. I had been left home by the family with the admonition to take care of the house until they returned. That's something they always say to me when they go out. Take care of the house, Harold. You're the watchdog. I think it's their way of making up for not taking me with them, as if I wanted to go anyway. You can't lie down at the movies and still see the screen, and people think you're being impolite if you fall asleep and start to snore or scratch yourself in public. No, thank you. I'd rather be stretched out on my favorite rug in front of a nice whistling radiator. But I digress. I was talking about that first night. Well, it was cold, the rain was pelting the windows, the wind was howling, and it felt pretty good to be indoors. I was lying on the rug with my head on my paws, just staring absently at the front door. My friend Chester was curled up on the brown velvet armchair, which years ago he'd staked out as his own. I saw that once again he'd covered the whole seat with his cat hair, and I chuckled to myself, picturing the scene tomorrow. Next to grasshoppers, there is nothing that frightens Chester more than the vacuum cleaner. In the midst of this reverie, I heard a car pull into the driveway. I didn't even bother to get up and see who it was. I knew it had to be my family, the Monroes, since it was just about time for the movie to be over. After a moment, the front door flew open. There they stood in the doorway, Toby and Pete and Mom and Dad Monroe. There was a flash of lightning, and in its glare, I noticed that Mr. Monroe was carrying a little bundle. A bundle with tiny, glistening eyes. Pete and Toby bounded into the room, both talking at the top of their lungs. Toby shouted, "Put him over here, Dad!" "Take your boots off. You're soaking wet," replied his mother. Somewhat calmly, I thought, under the circumstances. "But Mom, what about the—" "First, stop dripping on the carpet." "Would somebody like to take this?" asked Mr. Monroe, indicating the bundle with the eyes. "I'd like to remove my coat." "I will," Pete yelled. "No, I will," said Toby. "I found him." "You'll drop him." "I will not. You will too." "Mom, Pete punched me." "I'll take him," said Mrs. Monroe. "Take off your coats this minute." But she became so involved in helping the boys out of their coats that she didn't take him at all. My tranquil evening had been destroyed, and no one had even said hello to me. I whimpered to remind them that I was there. "Harold," cried Toby, "guess what happened to me?" And then, all over again, everyone started talking at once. At this point, I feel I must explain something. In our family, everyone treats everyone else with great respect for his or her intelligence. That goes for the animals as well as the people. Everything that happens to them is explained to us. It's never just, "Good boy, Harold," or "Use the litter box, Chester," at our house. Oh no. With us, it's, "Hey, Harold, Dad got a raise and now we're in a higher tax bracket," or "Come sit on the bed, Chester, and watch this Wild Kingdom show. Maybe you'll see a relative." Which shows just how thoughtful they are. But after all, Mr. Monroe is a college professor and Mrs. Monroe is a lawyer. So we think of it as a rather special household. And we are therefore rather special pets. So it wasn't at all surprising to me that they took the time to explain the strange circumstances surrounding the arrival of the little bundle with the glistening eyes now among us. It seems that they had arrived at the theater late, and rather than trip over the feet of the audience already seated, they decided to sit in the last row, which was empty. They tiptoed in and sat down very quietly so they wouldn't disturb anyone. Suddenly, Toby, who's the little one, sprang up from the chair and squealed that he had sat on something. Mr. Monroe told him to stop making a fuss and move to another seat, but in an unusual display of independence, Toby said that he wanted to see just what it was that he had sat on. An usher came over to their row to shush them, and Mr. Monroe borrowed his flashlight. What they found on Toby's chair was the little blanketed bundle that was now sitting on Mr. Monroe's lap. They now unwrapped the blanket, and there in the center was a tiny black and white rabbit sitting in a shoebox filled with dirt. A piece of paper had been tied to his neck with a ribbon. There were words on this paper, but the Monroes were unable to decipher them because they were in a totally unfamiliar language. I moved closer for a better look. Now, most people might call me a mongrel, but I have some pretty fancy bloodlines running through these veins, and Russian wolfhound happens to be one of them. Because my family got around a lot, I was able to recognize the language as an obscure dialect of the Carpathian mountain region. Roughly translated, it read, "Take good care of my baby." But I couldn't tell if it was a note from a bereaved mother or a piece of Romanian sheet music.
Chapter 2, Music in the Night. I feel at this time there are a few things you should know about Chester. He's not your ordinary cat. But then, I'm not your ordinary dog, since an ordinary dog wouldn't be writing this book, would he? Chester came into the house several years ago as a birthday gift for Mr. Monroe, along with 2 volumes of G.K. Chesterton, hence the name Chester, and a first edition of Dickens's A Tale of Two Cities. As a result of this introduction to literature, and given the fact that Mr. Monroe is an English professor, Chester developed a taste for reading early in life. I, on the other hand, have developed a taste for books. It seems that after I went to sleep, Chester, still stewing over the lost milk, settled down with his latest book and attempted to ignore the rumbling in his stomach. The room was dark and quiet. This did not prevent his reading, of course, since, as you know, cats can see in the dark. A shaft of moonlight fell across the rabbit's cage and spilled onto the floor below. The wind and rain had stopped, and, as Chester read, he became increasingly aware of the eerie stillness that had taken their place. As Chester tells it, he suddenly felt compelled to look at the rabbit. "I don't know what came over me," he said to me the next morning, "but a cold chill ran down my spine." It seems the little bunny had begun to move for the first time since he had been put in his cage. He lifted his tiny nose and inhaled deeply, as if gathering sustenance from the moonlight. He slicked his ears back close to his body, and for the first time, Chester said, I noticed the peculiar marking on his forehead. What had seemed an ordinary black spot between his ears took on a strange V shape, which connected with the big black patch that covered his back and each side of his neck. It looked as if he were wearing a coat. No, more like a cape than a coat. I've really got to stop reading these horror stories late at night, he thought. It's beginning to affect my mind. He yawned and turned to go back to his chair and get some sleep. As he turned, however, he was startled by what he saw. There in the moonlight, as the music filtered through the air, sat the bunny, his eyes intense and staring, an earthly aura about them. Now, this is the part you won't believe, Chester told me. But as I watched, his lips parted into a hideous smile, and where a rabbit's buck teeth should have been, 2 little pointed fangs glistened. I wasn't sure what to make of Chester's story, but the way he told it, it set my hair on end.
Chapter 3, Some Unusual Goings-On. The next few days passed uneventfully. I was very bored. Our new arrival slept all day, and Chester, whose curiosity had been aroused by the strange behavior of the rabbit that first night, had decided to stay awake every night to observe him. Therefore, he spent most of his days sleeping, so I had no one to talk to. The evenings weren't much better. Toby and Pete, who used to play with me as soon as they got home from school, now ran immediately to that silly rabbit's cage to play with him. Or at least they tried to. Bunnicula did not make the most energetic playmate. It took him quite a while to wake up each night, and then when he did awaken, he didn't do much except hop around the living room. He didn't play catch, he didn't fetch, he didn't roll over to have his tummy rubbed. I couldn't understand why they played with him at all. I expected it was because he was new and different. But I was confident that they would soon tire of him and come back to trusty old Harold. At this point, Mr. Monroe came downstairs to make breakfast. I wonder if Chester hadn't dreamed the whole thing. He did admit he'd fallen asleep, and as I said, he has quite an imagination. But I was game. After all, there hadn't been any excitement in this place for days. Chester and I took our positions under the kitchen table. We didn't have long to wait. "Holy cow!" Mr. Monroe yelped as he opened the refrigerator door. He took this funny-looking white thing out of the fridge and held it at arm's length. "Peter, come down here!" "What is it?" I whispered. "Beats me," Chester answered. "It looks like a white tomato." "Very funny," I said as Pete came into the kitchen. "Peter, have you been playing with your chemistry set in here?" "No, Dad. Why?" "Well, I thought this might be one of your experiments. Do you know what it is?" "Gee, Dad, looks like a white tomato." Just then, Mrs. Monroe and Toby came in the door. "What's all this fuss about?" Mrs. Monroe asked. "We were just trying to figure out what this is." Toby pulled it down so he could get a better look. "Well," he said, "it looks to me like a white tomato." Mr. Monroe took a good long look. "You know," he said to his wife, "it really does look like a white tomato." "There's only one way to find out," said Mrs. Monroe, who always was a practical one. "Let's cut it open and see what's inside." Everybody gathered around the table. I jumped up on a chair, and in all the excitement, no one noticed that I had put my paws on the table, which under normal circumstances was discouraged, to say the least. Chester wasn't so lucky. "Chester, get off that table," Mrs. Monroe said. Chester jumped onto Toby's shoulders, where he stayed to view the proceedings. Mrs. Monroe took her sharpest knife and cut cleanly through the thing. It fell in 2 halves. "It's a tomato, all right," said Mrs. Monroe. "Here are the seeds." "But it's all white," Toby observed. "And look," said Pete, "it's dry." "So it is," Mr. Monroe said as he picked up one of the halves. "There's no juice at all. Well, and what do you think?" "Well, it's gone bad, I guess, though I've never heard of a tomato turning white before." "Come on," she said, clearing the table. "Let's throw it out and have breakfast. And Harold, get your paws off the table." "Rats." Chester jumped down from Toby's shoulders and motioned for me to follow him into the living room. "This had better be important," I said. "They're cooking bacon." "A white tomato. Very significant," Chester murmured. "So it's a white tomato," I said, edging my way back to the kitchen door. "What does that have to do with Bunnicula?" "I can tell you one thing," Chester said. "I got a good look at that tomato. There were very suspicious marks on the skin. So, I believe they're teeth marks. So tonight I'm going to reread a book I read last year." "How fascinating," I said, as the aroma of frying bacon wafted across my nostrils. "And what book might that be?" "The Mark of the Vampire." "What?" I stopped dead in my tracks. "Meet me tonight after the others have gone to sleep. You'd better take a nap today so you can stay awake." Chester closed his eyes. I shifted my look to Bunnicula, who seemed to be asleep in his cage. A tiny smile sat upon his lips. A happy dream, I wondered, or something else. My reverie was broken by the sound of crunching bacon. I was in the kitchen in a flash.
Now tell me, Harold, have you noticed anything funny about that rabbit? No, I said, but I've certainly noticed a lot of funny things about you recently. Think about it. That rabbit sleeps all day. So do I. So do you. Furthermore, he's got funny little sharp teeth. So do I. So do you. Furthermore, he gets in and out of his cage by himself. What kind of rabbit can do that? A smart one, I said. I could do it. We're not talking about you, Harold. We're talking about the rabbit. Now, where did you find him? At the movies. Yes, but what movie? Dracula, I said. So, he said quickly, remember the note around his neck? What language was it in? An obscure dialect of the Carpathian mountain region, I answered smugly. He didn't know everything. Aha, Chester said, but what area of the Carpathian mountain range? Area? What's an area? I looked at him blankly. Transylvania, he cried triumphantly, and that proves my point. What point? What are we talking about? And don't forget about the white tomato. That's most important of all. But what? This book, said Chester, disregarding me, tells us just what we need to know. What? I practically screamed. What does it tell us? What does this book have to do with Bunnicula? What are you talking about? What's going on here? I can't stand it anymore. Chester regarded me coolly. You're really very excitable, Harold. That's not good for your blood pressure. I put my paws around his throat. Tell me, I said in a low, threatening voice, or I'll squeeze you until you pop. Okay, don't get upset. Now this book tells you everything you've always wanted to know about vampires, but were afraid to ask. Personally, I had never wanted to know anything about vampires, but at that moment, I was afraid to tell that to Chester. I still don't understand what vampires have to do with our little furry friend. 1, said Chester, vampires do not sleep at night. They only sleep during the day. The same holds true for this rabbit. 2, vampires can get in and out of locked rooms. Bunnicula gets in and out of his locked cage. This was beginning to interest me. Didn't you say something about the refrigerator? That's right. He got the refrigerator open all by himself. 3, vampires have long pointed teeth. They're called fangs. Well, don't we have fangs? No, we have canines. That's different. What's different about it? Fangs are more pointed, and vampires use fangs to bite people on the neck. Yuck! Who'd want to do that? Vampires would, that too. Wait a minute. I saw Mrs. Monroe bite Mr. Monroe on the neck once. Does that mean she's a vampire? Boy, are you dumb? She's not a vampire. She's a lawyer. She bites necks. I don't think that's quite the same thing. Now, Bunnicula does not bite people on the neck, at least not so far, but he does bite vegetables. It means he bites vegetables to make a hole in them, and then he sucks out all the juice.
5. Chester goes into his act. The next morning, I was awakened by a scream. Robert! Robert, come down here right away. There's something wrong in the kitchen. For a moment, panic seized me. I thought she'd run out of dog food, but then I remembered the events of the previous evening. Mr. Monroe came bounding down the stairs. Chester, Chester, I cried. Did you see Mr. Monroe? His face has turned white. It's Bunnicula, isn't it? No, he said calmly. It's shaving cream, you idiot. By now, the excitement in the kitchen was at full throttle. The table was covered with Bunnicula's handiwork. There were white beans and white peas and white squash and white tomatoes and white lettuce and white zucchini. What can it mean, Robert? Mrs. Monroe was saying. I'm getting worried. One tomato is a curiosity, but this is unheard of. There must be something wrong with our refrigerator. That's it. It's turning all the vegetables white. But look, she said. I left these tomatoes on the windowsill, and they're white too. And this squash I left in the bowl on the table. At that moment, Pete and Toby came into the kitchen. Holy cow, what's going on? Hey, maybe it's a vegetable blight, Mom. Could that be, Robert? Did you ever hear of anything like that? Well, no, actually, that is, I've heard of blight, but nothing like this. Chester leaned my way. This will take forever if we leave it up to them. Sometimes human beings can be so slow. I started to answer him, but he was heading for the table. What about that friend of yours in the agricultural department? Oh, Tom Cragen? Could we call him and ask him if we're doing something wrong? It's DDT, Mom, Peter interjected. I know about this stuff. It's because you buy vegetables that aren't organic. All vegetables are organic, Peter, Mrs. Monroe replied. That's not what my teacher says. See, Toby, I told you this would happen. They're using chemicals on our food, and if you're not careful, you'll turn white too. Mr. Monroe said, what about those vegetables? Shall I speak to Tom Cragen? Yes, dear, said Mrs. Monroe. Why don't you? I'm sure there's some explanation. In the meantime, I'll change markets.
Howdy, partners. This is Chapter 6, Harold Helps Out. That night, I had an uneasy sleep. Strange noises emanated from downstairs. It sounded like toenails clicking back and forth on the floor. It must be Bunnicula making his midnight run. I thought, although I'd never known him to make a sound, and I smelled the funniest odor in the air, something familiar, though I couldn't place it. As the night progressed, it grew stronger and stronger until finally it tickled my nose and I sneezed myself awake. I jumped off Toby's bed, still sniffling, and headed down the stairs for the living room to find Chester, to see if he could smell it too. The odor grew even stronger as I approached the living room. Standing in the doorway was Chester, a strange pendant hanging from his neck. Phew, Chester, I said, what are you wearing that awful thing for? It smells. Of course it smells, he replied. Here, I made one for you too. Put it on. Are you kidding? That thing smells like garlic. It is garlic, Chester stated matter-of-factly. Why are you wearing garlic, I asked, thinking that by this time Chester was capable of anything. As we walked into the living room, I tripped on another piece of garlic lying in the doorway. Careful, said Chester, watch your step. I surveyed the room and saw it was strewn with garlic on the doorways, over the windows, and around Bunnicula's cage. The poor little fella had buried his nose as far as possible under his blanket. I was about to follow his example and return to Toby's bed to bury my nose under the blankets when Chester grabbed my tail with his teeth. You're not leaving this room until you put this on, he grumbled at me. I think that's what he said. I wasn't sure because he had my tail in his mouth. It's not polite to talk with your mouth full, Chester. Drop that tail. Meanwhile, my eyes were beginning to water. Listen, Chester snapped at me, fortunately letting go of my tail first. The book said to use garlic. What book? I asked. The joy of cooking? Chester continued. The mark of the vampire says garlic renders vampires immobile. What does that mean? It means they can't go anywhere if there's garlic around. Well, I've got news for you, Chester. I can't go anywhere either. The smell is killing me. But you've got to put it on. It says so in the book. If you don't put it on, I'll put it on for you. Doe, Chester, I said as my nose suddenly and involuntarily closed. I'd be leaving this roob right now, Doe. And I did. I was so sick to my stomach from the aroma that I decided to spend the early morning hours outdoors. As dawn approached, it seemed that it would be a peaceful day. The sky was clear, the birds were singing, and I felt contented after my difficult night just to be lying in the grass, feeling the ladybugs crawling up my ears. Suddenly, the calm was broken. Strange, piercing screams came from the area of the kitchen. Not again, I thought. What's turned white now? As it happened, it was Chester. There in the sink, lathered with soap, was the feline detective yelling his head off. Mrs. Monroe was scrubbing him vigorously, and from the sound of her voice was in the middle of a long lecture. I don't know what's gotten into you, Chester. You never played with garlic before. I thought you hated the smell of it, and here you've gotten it all over yourself. Stop wriggling. You'll get soap in your eyes. If you want to chew on something, I'll get you some catnip, but stay out of my herbs. Then she rinsed him off, rubbed him with the towel, and plunked him down in front of the stove to finish drying. Shut the door, he hissed at me. I'm freezing. That silly woman doesn't know cats don't get baths. What do you mean? I get baths all the time, I said, closing the door with my back foot. That's because you're too dumb to bathe yourself. Cats always bathe themselves. It's a rule. Everyone knows that. Well, at least it smells nice in here again, I sniffed as I settled down next to Chester by the stove. And it's all toasty warm in the kitchen. Sure, it smells nice again, he said, but now this house isn't safe anymore. What do you mean? I asked, getting closer. I mean, it worked last night. The garlic worked. No more vegetables turned white, did they? No, but that means Bunnicula didn't get out of his cage last night. Maybe he was just tired, I said, or maybe he was full. Don't be ridiculous, he replied. It was the garlic. He couldn't leave his cage. But tonight he'll be free to roam again, and I've got to find a way to stop him that isn't smelly. Mr. and Mrs. Monroe were hurrying in and out of the room, stepping over us, late for work. Mrs. Monroe yelled up to Toby. She said, "Don't forget to take the steak out of the freezer when you get home today, Toby, and leave it on the table to defrost. And this time, remember to put a plate under it." Chester's ears perked up. "Of course," he said. "That's what I'll do." And he strolled past me with a knowing smile. Mrs. Monroe turned off the stove and left the room. It was too much for me to figure out, so I went to sleep on the nice warm kitchen floor. I was awakened by a bite on the ear. Chester was sitting by me looking very impatient. "Boy, nothing wakes you up," he said. "I've been yelling and poking at you for 10 minutes. "I was dreaming," I answered defensively, "about a place where there weren't any cats around to bother nice dogs and wake them up when they needed their rest." "You can finish sleeping later," he said crisply. "Right now you have to help me." "Do what?" I asked. "Get Bunnicula out of the cage." I sprang back. "Get him out of the cage? I thought that's what you didn't want. I thought you said he was dangerous. What if he attacks me?" "Aren't you ashamed?" Chester replied. "Afraid of a little harmless bunny?" "Harmless? I thought you said he was a threat to this house and everyone in it. Isn't that what you said? Isn't that what we've been talking about all this time?" "He is a threat, but only at night. During the day, He's just a very sleepy rabbit, and that's why we have to do it now while the sun is still up. Follow me, he said. There isn't much time. Toby stayed down here forever, and the others will be home soon. Boy, you must have been tired, Harold. You slept through lunch. I followed Chester into the living room. My heart was pounding as he unlocked the cage door with his paw. It looked as if he had years of experience opening locks. The door swung open. Bunnicula was sleeping peacefully. He did, however, look a little green around the gills, probably from the garlic. I was just wondering how a rabbit could have gills. When Chester said, "Okay, Harold, do your stuff while I get what I need from the kitchen." "Well, what do you want me to do? I can't read your mind." "Get him out of the cage and onto the floor, and I'll be right back," Chester said. What? What?" I verbalized. "How am I supposed to do that?" "Use your head," he answered, and he was gone. Looking at the cage, I realized that was precisely what I would have to do. Until this moment, I had never had to face the possibility of actual physical contact with a real live rabbit. I looked upon my chore reluctantly. I seemed to recall my grandfather telling me that one picked up a rabbit by its neck with one's teeth. This I attempted, though the very idea set my stomach churning. I squeezed my head through the tiny door and gently placed my teeth around the skin of the bunny's neck. To avoid any suggestion of violence, I'd never been one for the sport of hunting. I preferred to think of myself as the creature's mother, carrying it off to safety. Unfortunately, I couldn't carry it anywhere, for once my head was in the cage, it wouldn't come back out again. I couldn't go neither forward nor backward. At that moment, Chester appeared at the door, carrying in his mouth what looked every bit like a nice, big, juicy, raw steak. My eyes popped. My teeth dropped Bunnicula. My mouth opened, and I began to drool. After all, I had missed lunch. "Chester, what are you doing with that steak? Haven't you gotten him out of there yet? I can't get either of us out of here. My head's stuck." "Oh, Harold, sometimes I despair. Here, I'll get you both out. I should have done it all myself." He came over, dropped the steak just a few feet away from me, climbed up on my shoulders. "You pull your head out while I push against the cage." "Who gets the steak?" I asked. "Don't worry about the steak, Harold, just pull." "I would have more motivation if I knew who was to get the steak." Chester ignored me. I pulled. He pushed. I felt something go pop. We all fell in a jumble. Chester, the cage, Bunnicula, and me. When I looked around, Bunnicula was lying next to me, still sound asleep. "There you are," I said. "We got him out. Now let's eat." "No dice," Chester said. "Just read this to me so I'll be sure I'm doing it right." And he handed me a book. "That book again?" "Start at the top of the page," Chester said, as he picked up the steak. "Why don't you read, and I'll hold the steak?" Chester replied. I took it to mean that I was to start reading. "To destroy the vampire and end his reign of terror, it is necessary to pound a sharp stake." Chester interrupted. "A sharp stake?" he asked. "What does that mean?" "I'll taste it and tell you if it's sharp," I offered. "Oh, never mind. This will do. It's sirloin. Keep reading." "To pound a sharp stake into the vampire's heart. This must be done during the daylight hours when the vampire has no powers." "Okay," he said. "This is it." I'm sorry I had to go this far, but if they'd listened, this wouldn't have been necessary. He dragged the stake across the floor and laid it across the inert bunny. Then with his paws, he began to hit the stake. "Are you sure this is what they mean, Chester? Am I anywhere near as hard?" he asked. "It's hard to tell," I said. "All I can really see are his nose and ears. You know, he's really sort of cute." Chester was getting that glint in his eyes again. He was pounding away at the stake, harder and harder. "Be careful," I cried. "You'll hurt him." Chester increased his attack. I was really getting worried when the door opened and Mr. and Mrs. Monroe were suddenly with us in the room. "Chester," Mrs. Monroe screamed, "what are you doing with my dinner? Robert, get that steak away from Chester. And what's the matter with Bunnicula? Why is he on the floor?" Mr. Monroe took the beautiful steak away. I wished it was a fond farewell with tears in my eyes. As the kitchen door swung open, Chester whispered with cold determination, "All right, the last resort," and dashed into the kitchen. Seconds later, he was back, carrying his water dish between his teeth. He ran toward Bunnicula, and with a mad yowl threw the dish of water at the rabbit. Unfortunately, he was so hysterical that his aim was not the best. With water dripping from my ears, I watched Mrs. Monroe pick Chester up by the scruff of his neck and toss him unceremoniously out the front door. "Robert, we are going to have to do something about that cat. Look at this mess. Dinner's ruined, the poor bunny is out of his cage, and Harold is sopping wet." I tried to look as pathetic as I knew how. "Aw, poor Harold," Mrs. Monroe cooed as she dried me off. "You've had a rough day, you and Bunnicula. I don't know what's the matter with your friend, but unless he learns how to behave, he'll just have to spend the night outside." Mrs. Monroe, meanwhile, had restored Bunnicula to his cage, and the cage to the windowsill. I couldn't believe it when I saw that Bunnicula was still asleep. "And," Mrs. Monroe said, "the steak is ruined. Why don't we let Harold have it? He deserves a treat anyway, don't you, old boy?" I panted appropriately. After my delicious dinner, I turned my attention to the book still lying open on the floor. Another method of destroying the vampire is to immerse the body in water. The body will then shrivel and disappear as the vampire emits one last scream of terror. "Whew," I thought, so that's what he was trying to do. Thank goodness he missed. I had no regrets about missing a scene like that. Poor Bunnicula. I looked over towards the cage, and there on the other side of the window was a pathetic tabby face looking in. His little nose was pressed against the window. I couldn't hear him, but from the movement of his lips, I could see he was very unhappy. Poor Chester. As for me, Mrs. Monroe spent the evening petting me, and the family chatted with me all night long. And of course, I had the yummy steak dinner, so it wasn't such a bad day after all. Except that now my steak was all gone. Poor Harold.
Chapter 7, A New Friend in Need. In the days that followed, Chester's behavior was exemplary. He purred and he cooed, and he cleaned his paws, and he rubbed up against everyone's legs to show what a good boy he was. I was getting worried. Chester acts that way only when he has something devious in the back of his mind. But I didn't know what it was. He had tried everything in the book to get rid of vampires, and all his efforts had failed. But I knew from the expression on his face that something was definitely up. Of course, I didn't know for certain because he had not spoken to me since the steak incident. I guess he realized that my heart just wasn't in the destruction of the bunny vampire. In fact, I was beginning to like the little fellow. The Monroes were relieved by Chester's improved behavior. They didn't know how to account for his strange doings, but, to their credit, they were willing to let bygones be bygones. The only disturbing factor in all our lives was the reappearance of the white vegetables each morning in the kitchen. And yet, after a few days, even that stopped and life seemed to return to normal. One evening, I dropped by Bunnicula's cage to chat. I'd found myself doing that more and more since Chester had stopped talking to me. Of course, Bunnicula didn't talk back, but he was a good listener. I'd begun to think of him as a friend. A strange one, granted. but one can't always choose one's friends. I was distressed this particular evening to see that he was dragging his ears, as it were. He looked tired and listless. I felt his nose, and it seemed a little warmer than it should have been. I became alarmed. I ran over to Toby, who was doing a picture puzzle on the floor, and began to bark. Something. I do only in cases of extreme emergency, since even I do not care for the sound. "What's the matter, Harold?" Toby asked without moving. "Are there burglars?" I ran to the cage and looked at Bunnicula. I looked back at Toby and whimpered. Toby just looked confused. "Do you want to play with Bunnicula? Shall I take him out of the cage?" "Woof," I responded, indicating, I hoped, that was indeed what he should do. "I'll ask Mom and Dad, Harold. You wait here." He was back in a minute, shaking his head. "I'm sorry, Harold, but Mom says you can't play with the rabbit. It causes too much commotion." I looked down at the floor and whimpered again. "Sorry, Harold. Maybe later when we're all in here together." I regarded Bunnicula, whose eyes met mine. He gave a little shudder, and I felt like crying. My friend was sick, and I didn't know what to do. I wished I could tell Chester, but I knew it was no use. He was just too mad at me. I would have to sort this one out on my own. That night, I couldn't sleep worrying about Bunnicula. I decided to go downstairs and check on his condition. What I saw when I entered the living room horrified me. Bunnicula was out of his cage on the floor while Chester stood in front of him, a piece of garlic around his neck and his arms outstretched, blocking the kitchen door. Suddenly, it all fell into place. Chester was starving Bunnicula. Of course, that's why he seemed so listless. And that's why the vegetables had stopped turning white. Chester had made it impossible for Bunnicula to eat. "Chester!" I cried. Chester jumped a very high jump. "What are you doing down here?" He spat at me as he landed. "I know what you're doing, Chester, and the jig is up. That little bunny never hurt anybody. All he's doing is eating his own way. What do you care if he drains a few vegetables?" "He's a vampire," Chester snarled. "Today vegetables, tomorrow the world." "I think perhaps you're overstating your case," I suggested cautiously. "Go back to bed, Harold. This is larger than the two of us. It may seem harsh, but I'm only being cruel, to be kind." Who's he being kind to, I wondered, as I went back upstairs. The tomatoes and zucchinis of the world? Maybe a few cabbages? It just didn't make sense. But I could see I wasn't going to get anywhere with Chester tonight. Tomorrow, however, would be another story. And I was determined that, by hook or by crook, my friend Bunnicula would eat by sundown the next day.
Chapter 8, Disaster in the Dining Room. I realized that there was nothing I could do for Bunnicula that day, since he was sleeping, but that gave me time to plan my strategy. At first, I thought I would bring food to his cage, but then it occurred to me that Chester must be taking everything away that was given to him. Pete and Toby usually left lettuce for Bunnicula during the day when he was sleeping, and Chester, ever watchful, probably nabbed it each evening before the rabbit woke. No, there would have to be another way. I thought and thought all afternoon, and I could see that Chester had done a good job of isolating Bunnicula from his food. There was no way I could think of to overcome Chester's game plan. As evening drew closer and I grew more and more frantic, I stumbled into the dining room and saw the answer to my problem sitting before me on the table. It was a bowl of salad. All I had to do was get Bunnicula to the salad and let him get his fill before the family came in to eat. With that funny white dressing on it, they would never even notice if a few vegetables were white. I ran to the hallway to check the clock. 6:15. It would be 15 minutes before the sun went down and Bunnicula woke up. I would then need at least 5 minutes to get him from his cage to the table and feed him. All I had to do was make sure that no one came into the room until he had finished. I needed a good 20 minutes at least. I went back to the living room. Chester was asleep on his brown velvet chair, shedding in his sleep, still worn out from the previous night's activities. I checked upstairs. Toby was reading in his room, the last chapter of Treasure Island, I noted. Pete, who should have been doing his homework, was listening to records in his room. I ran down to the kitchen. "Hello, Harold," said Miss Monroe as I came through the door. "What's new? Other than a rabbit starving in the next room and an immediate attack on your salad bowl? Nothing," I thought. I stood at her feet and panted. She scratched my head. This gave me a moment to check out how far she was in her cooking. "Sorry, Harold," she said. I have to baste the chicken. I noticed that the oven timer still had 30 minutes to go. It'll be tight, but I thought I can make it now. "Where is Mr. Monroe?" I went to the front door and whimpered loudly. Miss Monroe followed me. "Are you waiting for Daddy, Harold? He'll be home soon." "Soon isn't good enough. How soon?" I whimpered again. "Patience, boy. He's late at a school meeting. He should be here any time." She went back to the kitchen and I checked the clock. 6:25. It was getting dark and Chester was still asleep. Time to swing into action. Having watched Chester undo the lock on Bunnicula's cage, and having participated in that unfortunate steak episode some days earlier, I knew I would have no problem getting Bunnicula out. I just had to be a little bit more careful where I positioned my head so that I wouldn't find myself in the humiliating predicament of getting stuck a second time. My timing was perfect. With Bunnicula swinging peacefully from my teeth, I made my way stealthily toward the dining room as the last rays of sunlight gave way to the dark of night. Once inside the dining room door, Bunnicula awakened in great bewilderment. It is not every day, after all, that one finds oneself, upon awakening, hanging from the jaws of a fellow creature, even so caring and gentle a creature as myself. Bunnicula opened his eyes wide and turned his face as best he could to me. I jumped up onto the nearest chair and placed the rabbit safely on the table's edge. "Okay," I whispered. There's your dinner. Go get it. Get your fill as fast as you can, poor bunny. I'll stand guard." I don't know that Bunnicula fully understood what was going on, but the sight of the vegetables piled high in the center of the table sent him scurrying in their direction. He was very hungry. As luck would have it, and as I should have anticipated, Chester's sense of timing was as astute as my own. No sooner had Bunnicula reached the edge of the salad bowl than the door swung open and Chester bounded into the room. He surveyed the scene frantically. I was unable to act fast enough, and upon seeing Bunnicula about to enjoy his first bite of nourishment in days, Chester leaped across the table, seemingly without touching the floor, chairs, or anything else between himself and our furry friend, and landed directly on top of the bunny. "Oh, no, you don't!" he shrieked. Bunnicula, not sure what to do, jumped high in the air and landed with a great scattering of greens smack in the center of the salad bowl. Lettuce and tomatoes and carrots and cucumbers went flying all over the table and onto the floor. Chester flattened his ears, wiggled his rear end, and smiled in anticipation. To cat observers, this is known as the attack position. "Run, Bunnicula!" I shouted. Bunnicula turned in my direction as if to ask where. "Anywhere!" I cried. "Just get out of his way!" Chester sprang, Bunnicula jumped, and in the flash of a second they had changed positions. Chester now found himself flat on his back, owing to the slipperiness of the salad dressing in the bowl, and Bunnicula, too dazed to even think about food now, hovered quivering on the table. Chester was having a great deal of difficulty getting back on his feet, but I knew it was only a matter of seconds before he attacked again. And I knew also that Bunnicula was too petrified to do anything to save himself. So I did the only thing I could. I barked, very loudly and very rapidly. The whole family rushed through the doors. Mr. Monroe must have just come home because his coat was still on. "Oh, no!" cried Miss Monroe. "That's it, Chester. That is the last stand. This is Chester's last stand." Chester rolled his eyes heavenward and didn't even try to move. "Mom," said Toby, tugging at his mom's arm, "look at Bunnicula. How did he get out of his cage? He looks scared." "Of course he's scared," Miss Monroe said. "We probably forgot to latch his cage and he got out, and I think Chester has been chasing him." Toby put his face closer to the rabbit. "Mom, doesn't Bunnicula look kind of sick?" "We better take them all to the vet to see if any damage was done," she answered. I started to whimper. "No need for me to go to the vet." Miss Monroe patted my head. "We may as well take Harold along," he said. He's probably due for his shots." Miss Monroe carefully picked Chester out of the salad bowl and carried him by the scuff of his neck to the kitchen. "I'm going to give Chester a quick bath," she said to Mr. Monroe. "Why don't you put together a fresh salad? Toby, you and Peter put Bunnicula back in his cage and then clean up the table." I didn't stick around for an assignment. This was not the time to be in the way. And besides, I now had a whole evening and night ruined worrying about the next morning's visit to the vet. This little effort of mine, I thought, has been a disaster in more ways than one.
Chapter 9, All's Well That Ends Well, Almost. Looking back on that night, I remember thinking that this whole mess could never be resolved happily. What would become of Bunnicula, my new friend who was suffering from starvation? And what of Chester, my old friend who seemed to have flipped his lid and, if you'll pardon the expression, was in the doghouse with the Monroes? A far greater concern at that time, of course, was my own future. For on that night, all that consumed my thoughts was the fear of the next day's injections. It all seemed hopeless indeed. But looking back on the next day, I can tell you that happy endings are possible, even in situations as fraught with complications as this one was. Early the next morning, we all piled into the car, some of us with greater reluctance than others, and trundled off to the vet. And by afternoon, we were on our way to solving our problems. The vet worked everything out very nicely. He discovered that Bunnicula was suffering from extreme hunger. I could have told him that. Rather than jar his fragile stomach with solid foods, the doctor decided he should be put on a liquid diet until he got better. So Bunnicula was immediately given some carrot juice, which he drank eagerly. After he finished, he looked over at me with a great grin on his face and winked. Chester was diagnosed as being emotionally overwrought. It was suggested that he start sessions with a cat psychiatrist to work out what the doctor called a case of sibling rivalry with Bunnicula. I asked Chester later what a sibling was, but he wasn't speaking to me. So I looked it up. It's like a brother or sister, and sibling rivalry means you're competing with your brother or sister for attention. I wasn't sure this was Chester's problem, but it sure explained a lot about Toby and Pete. As for me, well, I came out the best. Dr. Wasserman was all set to give me my shots when the nurse came in with my card. "Wait, doctor, this dog doesn't need his shots yet. It's too soon." So I got a pat on the head and a doggy pop instead. These days, everything is back to normal in the Monroe household. Almost. Bunnicula liked his liquid diet so much that the Monroes have kept him on it, and oddly enough, there have been no problems with vegetables mysteriously turning white since. Chester, of course, insists that this proves his theory. Obviously, Harold, the liquefied vegetables take the place of the vegetable juices, so Bunnicula has no need to go roaming anymore. "Then he's not a vampire," I said. "Nonsense, he's a vampire all right, but he's a modern vampire. He gets his juices from a blender." "Case closed, Sherlock?" I queried. "Case closed. Oh, Chester." "Yes, Harold? What are those two funny marks on your neck?" Chester jumped and I laughed. "Very funny," he said as he began to bathe his tail. "Very funny." The Monroes never knew anything of Chester's theory. They changed markets and to this day believe they were the victims of a curious vegetable blight. Bunnicula and I have become good friends. He still doesn't say anything, but he snuggles up next to me by the fireplace, and we take long, cozy snoozes together. One night, I sang him a lullaby in the obscure dialect of his homeland, and he slept very peacefully. It was that night that cemented our friendship. Now, about Chester. I said that everything was back to normal, almost. Naturally, Chester is the almost. He's been seeing his psychiatrist, Dr. Verrucht Katz, twice a week for some time now. He takes his therapy very seriously. The other morning, I was trying to get a little sleep when Chester came over and nudged me in the ribs. "Harold, do you realize we've never really communicated? I mean, really communicated?" I opened one eye cautiously. "And in order to communicate, Harold, you have to be really in touch with yourself. Are you in touch with yourself, Harold? Can you look at yourself in the mirror and say, I know who I am. I am in touch with the me-ness, that is me, and I can reach out to the you-ness, that is you. I closed my eye. I'm used to it by now. He talks like that all the time. He no longer reads Edgar Allan Poe at night, and once he concluded that he had been right about Bunnicula, there's been no more talk about vampires. The mark of the vampire sits, its usefulness obsolete, on its shelf. Right now, he's reading Finding Yourself by Screaming a Lot. And the other night, when I heard the most awful noise coming from the basement, I didn't even bat an eyelid. I knew it was just Chester finding himself, as he calls it. He explains to me he's getting in touch with his kittenhood, and I've told him that's fine, just to let me know when he's going to do it so I can be elsewhere. I've had enough trouble from Chester's adventures. So, that's my story, and the story of a mysterious stranger who no longer seems quite so mysterious and who is definitely no longer a stranger. I've presented the facts as clearly as I could, and I leave it to you, dear reader, to draw your own conclusions. I must now bring this narrative to a close, since it is Friday night, Toby's night to stay up late and read, and I can hear the crinkling of cellophane. I can only hope it covers 2 chocolate cupcakes with cream filling. So that's our story, Bunnicula, A Rabbit Tale of Mystery by Deborah and James Howe. Sure hope that you enjoyed our Wolford Reads this semester, and you got a lot of enjoyment out of the book. Stay tuned for next semester when our next series comes out.